The wind howled through the endless white expanse of the Siberian wilderness, biting through the thick layers of clothing that Nikolai wore to shield himself from the cold. The winter in Russia was always brutal, but this was something different, an unnatural, suffocating chill that seemed to seep into his bones. He had been driving for hours, his car struggling against the deep snowdrifts when he saw the faint outline of a cabin in the distance, half hidden by the dark pines of the surrounding forest. Nikolai had been traveling from the far north, delivering supplies to remote villages, and had taken a shortcut through the forest to save time. But as he approached the cabin, a strange feeling washed over him. The woods around it were silent, unnaturally so. No sound of wildlife, no rustle of the wind through the trees, just an oppressive stillness. He slowed his car and came to a stop in front of the cabin, its dark windows staring back at him like hollow eyes. The wooden structure was old, the kind of house that seemed to have been abandoned for years, yet there was a faint light glowing from behind the frosted windows. Despite the foreboding atmosphere, his instinct told him to seek refuge for the night. The storm had worsened, and he didn't want to risk driving further in the blizzard. Nikolai grabbed his duffel bag and approached the door. It creaked open before he could knock, revealing a man standing in the dim light of the hallway. His face was gaunt, pale, with eyes that seemed sunken into his skull, and his long hair hung in tangled strands. His clothes were old and frayed, as if they had not been replaced in decades. "You have come for shelter, yes?" The man's voice was a rasp, as though he had not spoken in years. "Just for the night," Nikolai replied, stepping in. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a wave, but it was strange, almost sickly sweet. It was not the comforting warmth of a fire, it was stale, as though the heat had been trapped in the air for far too long. The man nodded silently and gestured for him to sit. As Nicholas settled on an old dusty couch, he noticed the room was covered in layers of thick dust, as though no one had lived there in a long time. Yet the man seemed strangely present, watching him intently with his unsettling gaze. "Are you alone?" Nikolai asked, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on him. The man's lips curled into a faint, sorrowful smile. "I am, but not entirely. The forest watches, you see, it listens." Nikolai frowned, unsure of how to respond. "What do you mean by that?" For a long moment, the man didn't answer. Instead, his gaze seemed to drift towards the frost covered windows, as if listening to something distant. Then slowly he turned back to Nikolai. "There are things in the forest," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Things that the wind carries. You may hear them tonight." Before Nikolai could ask more, the man turned and walked into another room, leaving Nikolai alone with the cold shadows. He could feel the unease rising within him, but exhaustion overcame his fear. He decided to sleep, hoping the storm would pass and he could continue his journey by morning. But sleep never came. Around midnight, Nikolai was jolted awake by a soft sound of whispering, carried by the wind. At first, he thought it was just the storm, but then it grew louder, clearer, as though voices were weaving through the trees, calling his name in a language he didn't recognize. It was cold, unnatural, like the voices of the dead. He sat up in the dark, heart pounding. The whispers seemed to surround the cabin, closing in on him. He glanced toward the window and saw nothing but the swirling snow. But then a shape emerged from the forest. A tall, thin figure, dressed in tattered rags, walking slowly toward the cabin. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and its face, if you could call it a face, was a hollow mask of frost, empty eyes staring at him. Nikolai's breath caught in his throat as the figure stopped right outside the window, its cold, dead gaze locking with his. The whispers grew larger, more frantic, as though the figure was communicating with something or someone inside the cabin. Then the door creaked open and the man reappeared. his eyes wide and filled with terror. You shouldn't have listened, he gasped, stepping back into the shadows. Now they know you are here. Nikolai stood up, heart hammering. What's happening? Who are they? The man's expression was one of pure fear. The forest, it takes what it wants. It doesn't let anyone leave once it has them. Before Nikolai could react, the figure outside the window jerked forward, its long, bony hand pressing against the glass with a wet, rasping sound. The whispers now were a chorus, deafening in their intensity. The walls of the cabin began to creak and groan as if the house itself were alive, responding to the call of the forest. The figure outside slammed into the window, the glass shattering with a sharp crack. The wind howled as the shadows poured in, swirling around the room like a tornado. The man in the cabin let out a scream, but it was quickly lost in the cacophony of whispers. As the shadows closed in, Nikolai felt something cold and sharp wrap around his legs, pulling him toward the broken window. Desperately, he tried to fight it, but the shadows were too strong. The man's voice echoed in his ears as he was dragged out of the cabin and into the storm. You can never leave once you have heard the whispers. The forest has claimed you. The last thing Nikolai saw was the snow covered trees, their branches reaching toward him like skeletal hands as the whispers filled his ears, dragging him into the cold embrace of the forest. And then there was nothing but silence.